A self-made man, his privileged wife, and two strapping sons.
They had really the best of everything.
They would play outside, play hockey in the street.
Life seems oh so perfect. Until somebody decides to sever ties.
Because this is a body without a head, without hands, every little thing could be important.
The American dream becomes a bloody nightmare.
It's gruesome, it's tragic, and it's the stuff you usually just read about in the movies.
Welcome to Riverside, jewel of Southern California's Inland Empire. This charming city lies just an hour outside Los Angeles, but a world away from big city strife.
Its history is as a farming town, but over time, more and more people moved into Riverside County. People that live there love it.
Riverside has great community base, great schools, place where we want to raise a family.
Life in this historic, sun-soaked valley is so tranquil and serene. It's the last place you'd expect someone to lose their head. One of Riverside's hardest working families is the Batistas. They aren't the type to let a beautiful day go to waste. Today, Jose is playing handyman.
Jose had come to the United States from Belize, and he was a hard-working man. He felt that by working hard, he could achieve his American dream.
He shared the dreams that a lot of immigrants do when they come here. They want a better life. So he worked hard, not to be rich and famous and wealthy or anything, but he just wanted to be happy.
Jose is in the construction business. It isn't always easy, but he'd like to think he's built his family on a solid foundation. Of course, behind every successful man stands a strong woman. Wife Jane Batista. She plays the part of a loving housewife. But watch out if something is broken or out of place. She can become strong-willed and a little demanding.
All wrong. Fix it?
Something Jose takes in stride.
Jane's a no-nonsense type of person. Jane is the kind of person who is going to do whatever it takes to get what she wants, and no one, not even her family, is going to stand in her way.
Sophisticated Jane and master craftsman Jose may seem an odd pair.
Jane grew up very privileged, and the town where she grew up in, really, she was considered an heiress to a construction fortune. She was brilliant, by all accounts, and pretty. When she came in to a room, people noticed.
Quite a catch for lucky Jose. But it was Jane who pursued him.
Jane and Jose meet at a party. Jane knows this is what she wants, and she's going to go for it.
For over a decade, their bliss has blossomed for all to see. But every family has its hidden thorns. While Jane and Jose seem to value every moment spent together, their greatest treasures are their two sons, Jason and Matthew. College student Jason, the elder, is a 20-year-old science whiz.
Jason was very knowledgeable of chemistry. He was very smart. There wasn't anything that he didn't know.
Jason is a hard-working kid, just like his dad. His core identity is built into hard work, getting good grades, and at home, he's a loving son and a caring brother.
Does it get any better? He's gonna make somebody a really great husband one day.
While the older brother works hard to maintain perfect grades, younger brother Matthew is content just to skate by.
Matt's a casual, laid-back dude. He was fun to be around with and all that.
Matthew could make friends where Jason was kind of the outcast in school.
He would be talking and laughing. He seemed to be having fun.
Matthew, he actually was kind of adept as an athlete, and he loved hockey.
All in all, a great kid.
Needed money and all that, he was there. Let you come over his house when his mom would let him, or if she wasn't around, really.
Whether he's grinding rails or taking slap shots, Matthew just wants to have a good time. Today is Father's Day, and Jane and the boys can't wait to show Jose appreciation for all he does. Before Jose, Jane was married to another Central American man named Armando. And Armando, not Jose, is elder son Jason's biological father.
Jane and Armando's marriage dissolved pretty quickly after Jason was born.
Jane had a hard time dealing with the separation, but Armando took it even harder.
It caused a great deal of depression and anxiety in Armando, so much so that he ends up taking his car and committing suicide.
Jane has never been one to dwell in the past and keeps her feelings very private.
Jane never said Armando. Jane never spoke about him.
With those dark days behind them, the Batistas should be grateful for what they have. Not today. Dad isn't exactly thrilled with his gift. And clearly, there's something wrong with Mom. The littlest thing seems to set her off. Of course, there's a reason for the sour mood.
Things got increasingly worse because money was definitely an issue. They really struggled from paycheck to paycheck. You can imagine the burden that puts them already on this stressful marriage.
Jose's workload has always been a bit unpredictable. And Jane has to rely on outside help from her wealthy grandmother to keep their house running.
She was getting quite a bit of financial support from the family.
Pampered Princess Jane has no desire to be a welfare queen and demands Jose do something about it. It now looks like family dinners feature a side course of tension thick enough to cut with a knife.
Things really unravel with Jose. Before you know it, they're fighting a lot. She's trying to take control. She's belittling.
Because that's what people do. That's what a man does.
That relationship was very strained and emotional between the two. Got in heated arguments, a lot of fights.
Because I had a nice dinner without arguing.
Everybody took their hard positions and they stayed there. And it didn't just affect Jane and Jose.
Calm down. That's all I'm saying. Calm down.
The two sons are caught between Dad's brooding and Mom's snide remarks.
It affected Jason and Matthew in ways that were extremely deep.
Matthew especially.
It bothered him to talk about it, but he really didn't want to be open about it. It may have been depression, it could have been lack of love.
house was always chaotic. There's always arguing, yelling, things of that nature.
And lately, Jane's erratic behavior has been getting even worse.
It's one of those things where you want to respond to her behavior, but you just know that it's not going to do any good. She needed a lot of help. She needed mental help, a psychologist.
Looks like Jose has had enough.
It started to become rather alarming. We just weren't sure what was going on in that house, where this was going to lead.
In just a few months, their family life will be torn apart.
Jane turned on Jose and said something pretty rare for her to say, which is, "You're not gonna leave me too. You're not gonna leave me like Armando did."
Jose was clearly shocked that this happy family, this happy little encapsulation of the American dream that he had disintegrated, and it was really nothing more than a charade.
Jose may be heading out the door. But for Jane, Jason, and Matthew, the bad times are just beginning.
It was so tense. The air was thick in the house. There was a lot of hatred. And then things got worse.
Up next, one Batista loses their mind, and another loses their life. Was the skeleton in the family closet more than someone could bear? The Batista family of Riverside, California, is circling the drain. After months of nasty arguments with his wife, Jane, Patriarch Jose is finally making good on his threat to leave.
You're not gonna go.
Suddenly the house is torn apart. And the family dynamic has changed.
I was always feeling sorry for the boys, that they had to live with this.
And everybody's got to find their spot in the stress and the tension that's unfolding in this little family unit.
With Jose on his way out, Jane sinks into a deep depression. But she isn't the only one who'll have to cope with the patriarch's absence. Matthew is devastated at the thought of life without Dad. And soon, his sadness will be overshadowed by resentment. It's no fun at all living under his mother's rule.
He does find his own coping mechanisms. He just kind of withdraws and takes it. He cries in the moment, but otherwise he becomes pretty isolated.
As days turn into weeks, the icy cold relationship between Jane and Matthew still hasn't thawed.
Matthew, it affected him more. He wanted to bring friends over to the house, and he wasn't allowed.
I mean, there's some people, hide behind a mask where they act like they're happy, but really they're not.
Seems the promising jock now excels at a new sport, inciting his unstable mother.
She was starting to be somewhat abusive, and he was a little resentful for that.
Stop it! Stop it! Stop it!
The pressure is clearly getting to Jane. But her behavior is far beyond the norm.
She would also have bursts of loud crying, just carrying on.
What are you looking at?
Heard her yelling obviously at one of her sons. She was swearing at him and yelling at him, and it was just language and tone that I thought was rather shocking for a mother to be saying to her son. We were concerned that now we really knew what type of person we had living next door, and so we were trying to take every precaution we could. We didn't want to confront her. We tried to just ignore her and let her be. We didn't want to start any problems whatsoever.
Jane refuses to get treatment. And it seems her family is headed for ruin. Money has become tight, and Jane and the boys barely have enough cash to stay afloat.
Jane received money from her family. They wired Jane and the boys $1,500 a month.
As Jane is losing her mind, she can't hold a job. So she turns to the one constant support system she's had through her entire life.
The men in Jane's life have always paid the bills. Now Jane orders elder son Jason to step up and do the same.
That's it? That's all you got? There's no way.
He had 2 jobs. He worked on campus in the computer lab, and he also had another job working at a local hotel here.
He starts working as a clerk at area hotels, making even more money. I mean, you know, he's probably earning easily 20-something grand a year on his own and could have left. Now, Matthew is a different situation.
It might have been financial reasons, but I think also maybe Jason felt an obligation to stay there for his brother.
So college student Jason slaves away to support his little brother and lay about Mom.
With her behavior, we wondered how could she manage to actually work. We were wondering how can she support that house. The boys seemed to have nice clothes, and they had sporting equipment. She had a nice car, and yet she never showed any indication that she was going out every day to a job.
Being the breadwinner is a lot for the young man to take on, and that's not the half of it.
It becomes clear that Jason has taken Jose's place. Not only is he the family provider and the head of the household, but he's also the target for Jane's ridicule and disdain.
The money he earned went mostly to the household, and Jason was a little resentful.
With all the men in her life turning against her, Jane is at her breaking point. And in a few short days, their tumultuous private world will be splashed across every newspaper in Southern California. On a bleak January morning, the Orange County Sheriff's Department gets an odd call. There's been a strange sighting at the bottom of a ravine.
A citizen is driving in Orange County, and he sees what he thinks is a body. He's not sure whether it's a mannequin, and patrol deputies are dispatched, and they look at it.
The deputies confirm it's a corpse and radio in the homicide squad. When investigators finally reach the bottom of the treacherous ravine, they're greeted by quite the grisly sight.
They see this corpse that is headless, that is handless. It's a pale, pale lump of flesh that just looks like it's straight out of any horror flick.
Little did these investigators know, an even more macabre discovery awaits.
It's really one of the most shocking cases I've ever seen.
Coming up, a bone-chilling encounter with a cold-blooded killer. Investigators from the Orange County Sheriff's Office are puzzled over the discovery of a mutilated corpse at the bottom of a steep ravine.
No hands, both the hands are missing, cut off at the wrist, and the head's missing, cut off at the neck.
Clearly, whoever did the cutting didn't do it here.
Down at the scene, there's no blood. There's no blood whatsoever.
The corpse is nude, except for a pair of white underwear.
Detectives establish a crime scene because they know that without a head and without hands, every little thing could be important.
Including the type of implement used to sever the body.
We knew obviously it was some type of cutting instrument, but there were no weapons around the body.
Back at street level, two clues start filling in the puzzle.
Up at the top, there's a dirt area where it looked like there were tire tracks.
And another telltale discovery.
We found blood smears on one of the guardrails.
The blood evidence and tire tracks suggest the body was dumped from the highway and tumbled down into the ravine.
Just minor scrapes to the body that were post-mortem, which means after death, probably from being thrown off the cliff.
The medical examiner confirms the only identifiable piece of the puzzle: the victim's gender.
And we were able to see that it was a corpse of a female, a white female.
On close examination, there's a very fine red hair on this body, on the legs and on the arms. And investigators know at that point that they're probably going to look for a missing person who's redheaded. It's not a lot, but it was something.
But identification could prove next to impossible.
The dental records and the fingerprints are one of the first things, and that's gone. We don't have that now.
You can't see that person, you know who that person is. We couldn't tell age, so we knew it's going to be a difficult case to solve.
Detectives run the victim's DNA, but this crafty killer was very lucky.
The DNA from the victim did not get a hit in any of the systems.
The manner of death does at least tell investigators something.
To take the head and hands off, it's going to create a huge mess. And you have to be right there, right on top of it. It's very personal to do that.
Obviously, there's rage there, no love for this person, no care.
Of course, there's no way to find the killer until police can ID the deceased.
First thing that they do is they go into their database for missing persons, hoping that somebody somewhere in the last couple of days has reported a missing redhead.
We had no one missing that fit that description as far as a female white with red hair with a very tall build.
There's only one thing left to do: turn to the public for help.
You're reaching out to the press daily, seeking their assistance on trying to identify the victim.
How do you identify this woman? You can't even put her picture on the 6 o'clock news to say, we're looking for the identity of this woman. If you know her, where do you go? And that was the challenge that was going to be met by these investigators.
A case like this, we need the public's help.
This story became something of a media frenzy because as a journalist, I can tell you that when you hear about a homicide involving a corpse with no head and no hands, you're immediately intrigued. And this story caught on like wildfire.
Leads pour in, but each and every tip turns out to be a dead end.
As the days went on, and it went several days, you start to wonder, are you going to be able to identify her? Is anything going to come forward?
Until finally, there's a break.
We get a call from Oceanside PD. They had some information about a body possibly being dumped in a trash dumpster at a construction site.
Oceanside is more than an hour from the body dump site, a ritzy town chock full of private cul-de-sacs. And one gated community guard called police with an ominous tale.
He's at a construction site, and yet he sees a vehicle pulled up.
The driver opened the trunk to unload, but got spooked by the guard, who saw more than intended.
He saw a human foot protrude, which excited him.
The security guard reacted quickly.
He did a great job taking down that license plate and calling the police.
When officers back in Riverside run the plates, they're in for a surprise.
Immediately, we pull up the DMV photo of the registered owners. First photo that popped up was a photo of a white female that had red hair. Immediately, I knew that was my victim.
The woman in the picture is none other than Jane Batista. Word is she'd been spending so much time chasing men before her death. No one in her family reported her missing. Detectives have ID'd the torso, but it's taken several excruciating days to do so.
First 48 hours are crucial on cases. Unfortunately, we didn't have it on this one.
Part of our job is we have to be the voice for the victim. Now we have a victim, so now we're going to go do something with it.
Estranged husband Jose Batista is one person detectives are eager to track down.
The police go looking for Jose, and they find him in San Diego, less than an hour away from where Jane's body was found.
The patriarch appears distressed by the news, but admits his marriage to Jane had become a nightmare.
From the outside, this really looked like a happy family getting along in their neighborhood. But inside, there was a lot more stress and a lot more tension.
I'm not leaving.
It was Jane that was the one that was always acting out in her fits of rage. Just a wild look in her eye.
Finally, Jose had had enough.
After they separate, Jose gets a little apartment of his own and he really tries to rebuild his life. But Jane just couldn't let go. She would pop in over to his house. A woman was there.
Hi.
And Jane went bananas.
Who is this? What's her name? What's her name? Show up like this. I'm talking to her.
According to reports, Jane tried to attack him.
Please, no! I gotta go.
Sounds like a very troubled relationship.
It's one of those things about a standard homicide investigation. You're a suspect until you're not a suspect. And everybody that Jane knew Everybody that she came into contact with was a suspect.
The cops leave Jose's San Diego love nest with their investigation still ongoing. Meantime, detectives track back to Riverside to speak with Jane's two sons.
What you want to do is you want to talk to the last person that saw or talked to Jane.
They track Jason down on campus, studying his reaction as they break the news.
First thing you want to see is grief, heartache, right off the bat, instantly.
The question remains, why didn't Jason report his mother missing if she had been gone for 10 days?
Jason said she meets boyfriends and she goes away with them. And he believed on this particular instance, she was away with one of her boyfriends she met.
Ever since his dad left, Jason says Jane's been filling her emotional void with unknown men. Or is this just a story to cover the truth? Haunted by his father's suicide, tormented by his mother's demands, Jason had plenty of motive to kill.
This suicide had a very significant impact on Jason and his relationship with his mother. Jane became cold to him. She was really hard on him, on just the tiniest things in life. It's because looking at Jason reminded her of Armando and that tragic day.
But before cops turn up the heat on the elder brother, they want to safely bring in his younger brother, Matthew. So detectives set a trap.
We had asked Jason if he would help us. Jason called his brother Matthew and talked to him.
Jason asks where his baby brother is, while police listen in.
Matthew was out with his girlfriend looking for a prom dress.
Jason tells Matthew to sit tight. He's coming to meet him. Instead, Matthew is greeted by some of Orange County's finest.
It's a common practice to keep them separate because they want to interrogate them and interview them separately. The reason for that is so they can't get their stories straight.
Investigators know they have a sensitive situation on their hands and tread lightly.
So when they approach Matthew, detectives have to do two things. One, they got to tell him about his mother's death. But two, they have to figure out if he knew anything about it.
Who killed Jane is still anyone's guess. Did Jose, Jane's estranged husband, seek payback for years of emotional turmoil? Perhaps Matthew, the younger son, murdered Mom as revenge for forcing his dad out of the family home. Did elder son Jason snap under the pressure of being his mother's bank account? Or could the two brothers have worked together to take care of their common problem? Coming up, there's still one big surprise in store for detectives. Investigators in Orange County, California, are trying to solve the murder of Jane Batista. The victim's estranged husband, Jose, claims he's had no contact with Jane. Elder son Jason swears he knew nothing about the murder. And younger son Matthew is about to be questioned for the first time. The young man is eerily calm.
He didn't seem shocked, so he knew something had to be happening.
One interrogation room over, older brother Jason can't stay silent any longer.
Jason says, okay, I want to tell you guys the truth. I want to tell you guys what actually happened. I put the recorder up on the desk and interviewed him for a couple hours. He started from pretty much his childhood.
The elder son recounts memories from a horrible home life.
You're gonna let him go? Where are you going?
Living with a paranoid schizophrenic.
That much violence between children and a mother is unusual. It's shocking.
The neighbors could hear Jane screaming at the top of her lungs, screaming at the boys specifically. Make sure they get the chores done, get out of the house, profanity, things of that nature, to the point where it was disturbing the neighbors. Thuds on the walls, just stuff like that drew their attention.
What?
Matthew echoes Jason's traumatic tales.
Matthew's stories didn't match 100%, but they did give detectives enough to paint a picture of all the events that led to Jane's murder.
According to Jason, it all started one evening at home. Jane's undiagnosed illness was getting worse, and tension between Jane and the boys was palpable.
That night, Jason had decided he was done with this life with his mom. He was going to do whatever he had to do to make a change.
Where's my journal?
Instead of trying to calm his mother like he had so many times before,
Will you help me find it? Where is it?
Jason continues fanning the flames.
Now, give me my journal.
He holds up Jane's diary and calls into question everything his mother holds dear.
Give it to me. Shut up, give it to me.
Jason claims he tried to shield Matthew.
Go in the room.
Matthew says he goes into the room and he hears his brother and mom arguing.
He tries to drown out the arguing with his headphones.
Give it to me. I will kill you.
Jason knows just what to do to push her completely over the edge and reads aloud her innermost thoughts.
What's this? Shut up. Did you write all that?
He picks a fight with her and says the one thing that she can't stand. And she flew into a rage.
Stop it.
Jane gets so riled up that she slaps her elder son. Just the trigger Jason needs to unleash decades of pent-up frustration and anger.
Jason punched his mother so fiercely that he shattered the bones in her eye socket and begins manual strangulation of her.
It's not something that happens quick. You got to hang on to him for quite a while. You got to be real close to him. You got to be hanging on.
He keeps her there for 6 minutes until she stops struggling.
Of course, now he's got a bigger problem. How to cover the crime.
Jason drags her body into a bathroom.
Jason strips Jane's clothes off and places her in the bathtub.
And then he takes a kitchen knife and begins sawing at his mother's neck.
Jason uses the same knife to cut off his mother's hands.
Then when he finishes, he cleans up.
He's got to do something with her head and her hands. He puts them in a duffel bag and shoves the duffel bag in the closet.
Now to get rid of the rest of her.
He loaded the body up in a sleeping bag.
Matthew.
After that point, he told Matthew, hey, I need your help.
Jason changes. And the brothers silently stash their mother's corpse in the family car.
They drove around. They were able to find that large trash bin at that construction site and attempted to dump the body there when they were discovered and stopped by the security guard.
Jason loaded the body back into the car, but not before the guard took down the license plate.
They eventually made their way back into Orange County, coming up through that particular highway, going back into Riverside.
Finds the steep ravine, says that's as good a place as any, and hops out, leaves Matthew in the car, grabs that sleeping bag, and just hurls the body into oblivion.
Life in the Batista house carries on. With Dad gone and Jane's lack of friends, the brothers know nobody will come looking for their mother.
They had $1,500 coming in from the family members. They bought a big screen, and Jason moved into Jane's room. So now Jason's truly in charge.
They were living the life. Like, now they had all the stuff they wanted.
All the while, Jane's head and hands remain tucked away in the closet. Detectives are stunned at the brothers' revelation. CSI techs are sent to the house to retrieve the duffel bag.
One of the forensic scientists that were out on scene unzipped the bag, hands were together right next to her face, and the way they were preserved, there is no decomposition whatsoever.
Jason and Matthew both confirmed to police that Matthew had no role in the killing of Jane.
Nonetheless, both brothers are arrested and charged with their mother's murder. With nothing left to lose, Jason rolls the dice and goes to trial.
He believed himself to be smart and smarter than everybody he came in contact with.
Matthew testifies against Jason for leniency.
Matthew got time served, a little over 2 years, and then he was allowed to go home.
Matthew is released into the custody of his father, Jose. Jane's estranged husband is never implicated in her death. Jason Batista is found guilty and sentenced to 25 years to life for the brutal slaying of his mother.
Not only is this story shocking, but it's sad. It's sad.
There are some nights that seem in memory to arrive already glowing, already framed by music, already carrying the fragile confidence of people who have decided, for a few precious hours, to stop bracing themselves against the world. In Orlando, on a humid June weekend in 2016, the air lay warm over the streets long after sunset, thick with summer and neon, and the restless energy of people looking for release at the end of a long week. Cars slid through the city under traffic lights that blinked red, green, and amber onto windshields. Laughter spilled from open doors. Somewhere, heels clicked across pavement. Somewhere else, a phone lit up with a message saying almost there. The city did what cities do at night. It gathered strangers into small circles of joy. And inside one nightclub in a space known for noise and color and the unguarded relief of being among your own, people danced in the dark, believing, for those moments, that they were safe. The music was loud enough to shake the chest. Light moved across faces in quick bursts of violet and blue. Bartenders leaned over counters. Friends pressed close to be heard. Bodies moved in rhythm, not because rhythm solves anything, but because sometimes it lets people forget for a little while how much of themselves they are asked to defend in daylight. Pulse was more than a nightclub. To many, it was sanctuary with a dance floor. It was where names could be spoken the right way, where a glance across the room could land without fear, where softness was not a liability, where flamboyance was not a dare, where grief and loneliness and family rejection could, at least for an evening, be pushed back by baths, sweat, bright clothes, and the simple miracle of being seen. Queer spaces have always had to perform a double function. They are celebration and shelter at once. They are places where people go not only to have fun, but to breathe differently, to lower their shoulders, to stop scanning every face for danger, to be ordinary in ways the outside world often refuses to allow. That is what gives such places their tenderness, and what makes any violence done there feel larger than the room that contains it. An attack in such a place is never only an attack on a building or a crowd. It strikes at the idea that somewhere, anywhere, there might still be a corner of the world where those inside can belong without apology. The night had the shape of a weekend story people expected to remember for harmless reasons. The date sat near the edge of summer. It was Latin night, one of the evenings that drew many in with music that carried warmth in its bones, the kind that invited movement even from the shy and the tired. There were people in bright shirts, people who had come straight from work, people celebrating birthdays, people escaping breakups, people standing at the threshold of adulthood, people who had crossed deserts of silence just to arrive at a room where nobody would ask them to be smaller. There were best friends who knew one another's history by heart and strangers who would become, by dawn, names read in disbelief across the country. There were mothers asleep in nearby homes, unaware that the messages they would soon receive would divide their lives into before and after. There were fathers who would later stare at screens, replaying missed calls. There were siblings who would begin the slow lifelong labor of learning how to say a loved one's name in the past tense without breaking apart each time. But at the beginning, before history stamped its black seal across the date, there was only the ordinary beauty of people making plans inside a night they trusted. This is how catastrophe often comes. Not with thunder rolling in from miles away, not with a warning visible to everyone, but by stepping across the threshold of an ordinary hour and tearing it open from the inside. That is one reason such events haunt so deeply. The mind wants disaster to announce itself. It wants a sharp change in weather, a silence in the birds, a stranger's face already marked by menace. Instead, horror so often enters, while the ice is still clinking in glasses, while someone is fixing their hair in a bathroom mirror, while another person is laughing mid-sentence. It arrives in the middle of life doing what life does, and because of that, the contrast becomes unbearable. 1 minute a room is alive with heat and music and flirtation, and the next it is a chamber of panic where every second stretches into something almost impossible to survive. To understand why the Pulse nightclub murders reverberated so powerfully across the United States, one has to understand not only the scale of loss, though that alone was enough to stagger the nation, but the layers of meaning crushed together in a single night. 49 people were murdered. Many more were injured. Families were shattered. A city was traumatized. Yet the wound did not stop there. The place was a queer club, the chosen refuge for LGBTQ people, many of them Latino, many of them carrying the intertwined vulnerabilities that come with race, sexuality, immigration stories, economic strain, religious conflict, and the quiet burden of living in a country where acceptance can still evaporate the moment one steps outside the wrong room. This was not violence in a neutral space. It erupted where people had gone specifically to escape the very pressures that make queer life for so many a negotiation between visibility and risk. In that sense, the attack felt intimate even to those hundreds or thousands of miles away. It touched an old communal memory. Long before modern headlines, queer people had learned to measure doorways, neighborhoods, glances, exits. They had learned that safety is often conditional, sometimes temporary, always precious. So when news broke that a nightclub had become a killing ground, Many heard not only the facts of one crime but the echo of a much older threat, the recurring message that even joy can be targeted, even sanctuary can be invaded, even a dance floor can become a battlefield. And then there was the other language that immediately rushed in around the event, the language of terror, extremism, mass casualty violence, ideological performance, grievance, spectacle. Modern America has seen enough public bloodshed to have developed a grim vocabulary for it, a set of familiar phrases spoken by anchors and officials in the first standards after bodies are counted. Yet the Pulse massacre resisted neat categorization even as public discourse tried to force it into one. It was discussed as terrorism. It was discussed as a hate crime. It was discussed as an assault on the LGBTQ community. It was discussed as another mass shooting in a country numbed and reawakened by the repetition of such horrors. Each frame captured part of the truth, but none could fully contain the human reality inside the club that night. Young people hiding in bathrooms and texting loved ones. Bodies pressed together in terror, wounded survivors trying to stay conscious by thinking of home, friends calling names over the wreckage of music turned into screams. Labels matter in law and politics and history, but on the floor of catastrophe, what matters first is fear, then pain, then the desperate instinct to live one more minute. Before the country knew names and biographies, before photographs of smiling faces were assembled into collages of public mourning, before investigators and politicians and commentators entered the story, the event existed in a more primal form. It was confusion. It was noise without meaning. It was people dropping to the floor because others were dropping. It was the terrible slowness of realizing that what at first feels impossible is happening anyway. The human mind resists that recognition. It bargains with it. Firecrackers, maybe. A fight. Some malfunction of sound, some error of perception, but reality has its own hard edge. Once it cuts through denial, panic moves with brutal speed. In survivor accounts from events like this, one detail returns again and again. The body understanding danger a fraction before the mind can bear to name it. Muscles tense, breath shortens. Vision narrows. The room that moments earlier promised freedom becomes a maze. Every doorway matters. Every obstruction matters. Every person you love in that room becomes instantly impossible to account for. And because nightclubs are built for atmosphere, not evacuation, their shadows and narrow passages can turn in an instant from decoration into peril. But even that is still too clean a way of putting it. There is nothing clean about a massacre. There is only the raw collision between ordinary civilian life and deliberate human destruction. One side arrives in eyeliner, party clothes, and hopeful messages. The other arrives carrying death. And afterward, the survivors inherit not just memory but fragments, the smell of spilled alcohol mixed with something metallic and unforgettable, the press of strangers against the same hiding place, the unnatural pitch of someone screaming a name that never gets answered, the glow of a phone screen in a dark pocket of fear, the dazed silence that can follow the worst sounds a person has ever heard. Such fragments do not stay in the past. They return in dreams, in crowded rooms, in sudden noises, in anniversaries that reopen the body's old alarm. The dead are mourned publicly. Survivors often carry their aftermath in private, in flashbacks that arrive without asking. The nation woke to the news in pieces. First came alerts and confused headlines. Then images of police lights pulsing in darkness. Then numbers that kept rising. Then the dawning realization that this was not one more local tragedy, not something that would remain contained within a city block in central Florida. It had already spread outward through every network that binds grief to geography. Families converged on hospitals. Friends gathered wherever screens were available. Community centers filled with people desperate for information and terrified of finding it. Churches and vigils and memorial sites began to take shape almost immediately, as if collective mourning in America now possesses its own emergency reflex. Flowers were laid down before the final accounting had even settled. Candles trembled in humid air. Strangers embraced one another with the stunned intimacy that follows public violence. And above all, the names began to emerge, each one collapsing abstraction into personhood. A number can stun, a name can break the heart. A name comes with a face, a laugh, a mother, a favorite song, a way of entering a room. A name reminds the public that what has been described as an incident was, for each victim, the end of an entire universe. It is tempting, in retrospect, to see that night only through its climax, to let the violence eclipse everything that came before it. But that would grant the killer too much power over the story. The hook of this case, the reason it continues to grip the national conscience, lies partly in the brutality of what occurred, and partly in the deeper insult it carried. A place built for life, for expression, for communal warmth, was converted in minutes into a site of national mourning. The very contrast is what makes the event feel almost unbearable to revisit. The dance floor and the crime scene occupy the same physical space in memory. Glitter and blood share the same floorboards. Celebration and obliteration become inseparable. In the aftermath, Americans argued, as Americans always do after mass death, about motive, ideology, firearms, warning signs, law enforcement response, radicalization, bias, politics. Those arguments were inevitable, and many were necessary, but underneath them all remained a simpler, heavier truth. People went out dancing and did not come home. They had trusted the night. They had trusted the walls around them. They had trusted that a place known for music would remain a place for music. Instead, the country found itself looking into a wound made at the intersection of hatred, spectacle, and vulnerability, and recognized something frightening about itself there. For queer Americans especially, the shock carried an old bitterness. Progress had been real, visible, even historic in the years leading up to 2016. There had been legal victories, cultural shifts, a growing public language of recognition, yet progress has never moved in a straight line, and visibility has never guaranteed safety. Pulse forced a painful question back into the open. What does acceptance mean if refuge can still be shattered in a single night? What does national celebration of equality amount to when bodies can still be stacked in a room built for freedom? The attack exposed the distance between symbolic inclusion and actual security. It revealed how quickly marginalized joy can be recast as vulnerability, how easily a place of self-expression can be marked as a target precisely because it dares to exist. That is why the story cannot be told merely as one more episode of American violence. It belongs to the history of queer survival, queer mourning, queer assembly, and queer refusal to disappear. By dawn, Orlando was a different city from the one it had been at dusk. The streets were the same, the humid air the same, the palm trees motionless in the first light, but the moral weather had changed. Something unspeakable had happened inside a space where people had come to feel ordinary and alive. Sirens had carved through the night, emergency rooms had filled. Families had entered the oldest nightmare known to love, the wait for news that might confirm hope or destroy it. And beyond Orlando, millions of people who had never set foot inside Pulse felt the floor tilt beneath them. They knew that name now. They knew it because it had become shorthand not only for loss, but for the fragility of safe spaces in a country that too often confuses visibility with protection. In the years since, the story has remained painful because it contains so many American truths at once, these with which weapons can turn private grievance into public slaughter. The persistence of hatred against queer communities, even in times of apparent progress, the ways ideology and identity can be invoked, distorted, or weaponized under the pressure of violence. The media machinery that descends upon grief, the rituals of mourning that rise afterward, the speeches, the candles, the flowers, the names read aloud into warm night air. Yet before all of that, before the investigations and the official statements and the debates over motive, there was a room full of people trying to live. That must remain the first image because it is the one the violence tried hardest to erase. A crowded club in Orlando, Latin music reverberating through darkness, faces lit in pulses of blue and magenta, friends leaning close to laugh, someone stepping onto the dance floor as if the night belonged to them at last. And over all of it, invisible for a few final moments, the tender illusion that sanctuary could hold. Orlando had spent years teaching the rest of the country to picture in a single way. For millions of Americans, the city existed first as a vacation promise, a place of theme parks, artificial sunsets, rental cars, and family photographs taken under carefully managed light. It was sold as a kingdom of escape, a machine built to manufacture delight. But every city has another face, the one that reveals itself after the tourists drift back to their hotels and the workers finish long shifts beneath the smiling surface of the entertainment economy. Orlando, in 2016, was not only a destination. It was a working city, sprawling and humid, stitched together by service jobs, apartment complexes, immigrant neighborhoods, late-night roads, and pockets of local culture that had nothing to do with roller coasters or castles. Beneath the polished fantasy marketed to visitors stood a more intimate city of bartenders, nursing assistants, security guards, restaurant workers, students, performers, hotel staff, young parents, and people still trying to decide whether Florida would be the place where they built a life or merely the place where they endured one. In that quieter Orlando, queer nightlife mattered for reasons outsiders often underestimate. It was not simply nightlife. It was infrastructure. It was a social map for people who had spent too many years being cautious in churches, silent at family tables, or carefully edited in classrooms and workplaces. A gay club in such a city could become part sanctuary, part celebration, part bulletin board, part unofficial counseling center. It could be where somebody first used the right name, where somebody else found chosen family after being pushed from their biological one, where a person newly arrived from Puerto Rico or Mexico or a conservative southern town found, at last, a room in which they did not have to monitor every gesture. That was part of what Pulse had become by the time the summer of 2016 arrived. Opened in 2004 by Barbara Poma and Ron Legler, the club was created in memory of Poma's brother John, who had died of AIDS-related illness in 1991. Even its name carried a memorial beat, a suggestion that a life and a spirit could continue as rhythm, as energy, as a pulse that refused to disappear. Over the years, the venue grew into more than a dance club. Accounts of its history describe it as a community hub tied not only to nightlife but also to educational events and partnerships involving HIV prevention, breast cancer awareness, immigrant rights, and LGBTQ advocacy. It developed a reputation as one of Central Florida's most visible queer gathering places, a club with themed nights, drag performances, loud rooms, theatrical lighting, and the kind of magnetic familiarity that makes regulars feel they are entering not a business but a living social organism. By the time of the attack, it had stood for more than a decade as one of the city's best-known LGBTQ spaces. History one to understand the atmosphere around Pulse. It helps to remember where queer life in America stood in 2016. From a distance, the period could look triumphant. Same-sex marriage had been legalized nationwide by the U.S. Supreme Court less than a year earlier, and public support for legal same-sex marriage had crossed into majority territory, with Pew finding in March 2016 that 55% of Americans favored it while 37% opposed it. The shift had been dramatic enough that many people, especially those outside queer communities, had begun speaking as though the central battles were over, as though visibility and legal recognition had naturally matured into safety. Rainbow logos appeared more often in corporate campaigns, Pride celebrations were larger, brighter, more commercially acceptable. Politicians learned the language of inclusion at least well enough to repeat it into microphones. But legal victory is not the same thing as social ease, and symbolic inclusion is not the same thing as security. Even in that supposedly forward-moving moment, attitudes remained divided. Religious exemptions were fiercely contested, and many LGBTQ people still move through daily life with the older instincts intact, checking whether it was safe to hold hands, whether a joke at work had crossed into threat, whether a family gathering would turn cold, whether the place they had chosen for a date or a drink was truly theirs for the evening or only conditionally so. The year 2016 sat in that uneasy space between progress and backlash, when celebration and danger were not opposites, but neighbors. Pew Research Center to Pulse existed inside that contradiction. It was glamorous and ordinary at once. It glittered, but it also served practical emotional needs. To some outsiders, a nightclub can seem like a frivolous setting, a backdrop for excess rather than a serious cultural institution. For marginalized communities, that reading misses almost everything. Historically, bars and clubs have often functioned as some of the only accessible places where queer people could gather in public, see one another without disguise, exchange information, flirt, grieve, celebrate, and learn how to inhabit their own identities in the company of others. The dance floor is not separate from politics when politics has spent generations deciding who is allowed to feel safe in public at all. A bar stool can become a place where a teenager, newly disowned, hears for the first time that survival is possible. A drag show can become a civic statement. A themed night can become a weekly ritual that steadies people through days lived under pressure. That was especially true in a state like Florida, where bright beaches and tourist brochures have long coexisted with harsher social realities, and where visibility can feel vivid but fragile. Pulse did not hide what it was. That openness was part of its beauty. It was also part of its vulnerability. On Latin Night, that vulnerability and beauty became even more layered. Waiters reported after the massacre that most of the 49 victims were Latino, more than half of them of Puerto Rican origin, with others including Mexican and Dominican victims. That detail matters not as demographic trivia but because it reveals the full texture of the room that was attacked. Pulse was not only a queer space. On that night it was also a Latino space, pulsing with the music, language, and social rhythms that made many patrons feel doubly at home. For people navigating both homophobia and the pressures of migration, bilingual life, family conservatism, economic precarity, or racialization in the United States, a night like that could carry a special warmth. The music was not generic background noise. It was memory. It was childhood kitchens, street festivals, cousins, breakups, summer heat, long drives, dance steps learned before adulthood hardened into caution. Latin Night could draw those who came for reggaeton and salsa as much as for the relief of being among queer people. It offered not just generic acceptance, but a culturally specific kind of belonging. That is one reason the massacre sent shock waves so deeply through Puerto Rican and broader Latino communities, as well as through LGBTQ America. The room that was struck was layered with overlapping forms of intimacy. Waiters 3 in another sense, the context of 2016 was shaped by a national exhaustion that had already begun to harden into ritual. America by then knew mass shootings too well. Each new one arrived with a familiar sequence: breaking news banners, half-verified reports, police cordons, rising casualty numbers, profile photos drawn from social media. Grief made public before families had even absorbed private loss, then the inevitable debates over guns, ideology, warning signs, policy, policing, radicalization, media language, and political exploitation. Pulse entered that grim American archive immediately, and at the time it was described as the deadliest mass shooting in modern U.S. history. later surpassed by Las Vegas in 2017. It was also quickly understood as the deadliest act of violence against LGBTQ people in U.S. history, and because the killer pledged allegiance to ISIS during the attack. As an event entangled with the post-9/11's language of terrorism, the country did not know how to hold all of those realities at once. Was this a hate crime, a terror attack, a mass shooting, an assault on a queer sanctuary, an expression of warped ideology, an act of misogynistic and homophobic rage, or some unstable fusion of all of them? Public discourse rushed to categorize it before the blood had dried, because category is one of the few tools modern societies reach for when horror exceeds comprehension. But on the ground in Orlando, the more immediate truth was simpler and more devastating. A room built for music had been turned into a site of slaughter. Encyclopedia Britannica for the city itself carried special emotional weight in the aftermath, because Orlando is a place so heavily associated with orchestrated happiness. That contrast made the event feel, to many Americans, especially obscene. It is one thing for violence to erupt in a landscape already coded in the public imagination as harsh or dangerous. It is another for it to rip through a city branded as family-friendly and sunlit. Yet local people knew that Orlando's apparent innocence was always partly an illusion built for outsiders. They knew the invisible city beneath the tourism economy, the late shift fatigue, the transient friendships, the sprawling roads and apartment lots where workers came home after midnight, the cultural worlds that tourists rarely touched. Pulse belonged to that local Orlando. It was not a prop inside the fantasy, it was part of the real city that existed beyond it. When the massacre happened, the nation's attention suddenly swung away from attractions and toward the people who actually lived there, worked there, danced there, and mourned there. For a moment, the theme park version of Orlando fell away, and the city was seen instead through police lights, hospital corridors, community centers, and the faces of parents waiting for news. That shift mattered because it exposed a deeper truth about American cities. Every place sold as escape is also home to people carrying ordinary burdens and extraordinary vulnerabilities. Pulse was not some abstract symbol dropped onto a map. It was local, beloved, habitual, a place people counted on. The deeper history of queer spaces in America also hangs over the context of this case like a long, quiet shadow. LGBTQ bars and clubs have never been just places to drink. They are woven into a history of raids, harassment, secrecy, solidarity, performance, resistance, and self-invention. For decades, such spaces offered forms of public existence unavailable elsewhere. They were where people could test the possibility of being fully seen, even if only for a few hours. That history gave Pulse a lineage larger than Orlando. It belonged to the same tradition of refuge that had sustained queer communities through the AIDS epidemic, through moral panics, through family rejection, through routine invisibility, through laws and customs designed to make queer life private, ashamed, or impossible. The founder's connection to a brother lost during the AIDS years sharpened that lineage. Pulse was not born merely as a commercial nightlife venture. It carried memory inside its walls. Its origin story linked it to an earlier chapter of queer grief, one in which loss had already taught LGBTQ communities how to build sanctuaries out of music, mutual care, and stubborn visibility. That is part of why the attack felt so historically cruel. It struck not only the living crowd of one summer night, but a place already shaped by remembrance. History won by June 2016, Pride season was underway across the United States, and Reuters later captured how the massacre's shadow fell across those celebrations. With marchers carrying victims' photographs and moments of silence interrupting what would otherwise have been parades of exuberance. This timing intensified the emotional force of the attack. June is ordinarily when LGBTQ visibility becomes most public, when shame is most openly rejected, when streets fill with bodies and colors and slogans that insist queer life belongs not in corners but in daylight. To strike a queer nightclub in June, during that season of heightened visibility and collective joy, was to wound not just a city but a national mood. It turned pride from celebration toward mourning almost overnight. Yet it also revealed something else, something difficult and defiant. Queer communities know how to grieve in public because they have had to do it before. They know how to stand in candlelight and say names. They know how to turn memorial into warning and warning into solidarity. They know how to insist, even while trembling, that a place attacked for what it represented must continue to be represented. Pulse would become a memorial site in the years after, but even before any official memorial was planned, it had already entered that sacred emotional category in the minds of many people. The place where joy was interrupted, and therefore the place where joy must be remembered with almost painful care. Raiders 5. There is another essential piece of context that sits beneath all the others. Vulnerability is not distributed evenly. The people drawn to Pulse on Latin Night were, in many cases, living at the intersection of multiple precarities. Some were young and still dependent on families who did not fully accept them. Some were immigrants or the children of immigrants. Some worked low-wage service jobs with little cushion against injury, trauma, or sudden absence. Some were still building adult lives unstable enough that one missed paycheck could trigger crisis. Some had not disclosed their sexuality or gender identity widely and would find, in the aftermath, that surviving or dying in a gay club forced truths into the open before they were ready. Waiters reported a year later that for some survivors the tragedy also exposed them as LGBTQ to relatives and communities who had not known. This is the kind of detail statistics cannot hold. A mass casualty event does not strike everyone on equal social footing. It detonates inside existing structures of silence, poverty, stigma, kinship, and fear. So the context of Pulse is not only the history of American mass violence or the politics of terrorism or the story of one nightclub. It is also the lived reality of young queer and Latino people trying to carve out one breathable corner of the world. Waiters 6. All of that formed the atmosphere before the shooting ever began. A city with two faces, a club born from earlier queer loss, a community still balancing progress against danger, a pride season alive with visibility, a Latin night carrying its own cultural heartbeat, and a country already numbed by public bloodshed but not yet prepared for what this particular crime would mean. The context matters because it shows that the massacre did not fall onto empty ground. It struck a place dense with memory, identity, ritual, and longing. Pulse was a room where people went to feel ordinary in a world that often made them feel exposed. It was a place where grief from earlier decades had already been transformed into music, where community had been built night after night under lights meant to flatter rather than reveal. In that sense, the tragedy of June 2016 began long before the first shot. It began in the old American pattern by which marginalized people must build sanctuaries because the wider culture does not reliably protect them, and by which those sanctuaries, once visible enough to matter, can also become targets. That is the ground on which the rest of this story stands, not only a nightclub in Florida, but a refuge carrying the pulse of survival, waiting in the warm dark of an ordinary Saturday night for the violence that would force the entire nation to learn its name. If this part must carry the voice of the victims, then it has to begin before the gunfire, in the hour when they were still only themselves, not names and headlines, not photographs held above candlelight, not statistics folded into public mourning, but people dressing for a Saturday night in June and deciding for reasons both simple and profound to go where the music would be loud enough to drown out the week. Pulse was, by every account the city preserved afterward, a place where people felt welcomed and safe enough to be their true selves, and on the night of June 12, 2016, nearly 300 people were inside for Latin Night, moving through the ordinary rituals of an evening they believed belonged to joy. PulseOrlando.org 1. Some came because it was Saturday. Some came because friends had invited them. Some came because reggaeton and Latin pop and sweat and colored light offered a release that was not available anywhere else. Some came because queer spaces are never just entertainment. They are rooms in which fear loosens its grip for a little while, where a person who spends daylight measuring every gesture can let their body move without self-surveillance. Many of those in the club that night were Latino, and Reuters later reported that most of the 49 people murdered were Latino, with more than half of them of Puerto Rican origin, meaning the room did not hold only one form of belonging but several at once, layered together in language, rhythm, family memory, migration, and queer survival. PBS to imagine the victims only at the moment of terror is to let the violence flatten them. The truer statement begins earlier, with youth and routine and desire and tenderness. They were hairstylists, accountants, theme park employees, students, sons, daughters, brothers, friends. The published lists of the dead made that heartbreakingly plain: 20 years old, 21, 23, 25, 33, 37, 40. Lives interrupted at every stage from early adulthood to settled middle age. PulseOrlando.org 3. In the hours before the attack, the victim's statement was written in ordinary gestures. It was in the mirror check before leaving home, in the text that said "almost there," in the rideshare pulling up to the curb, in the hand pressed briefly to a friend's shoulder while crossing the room, in the particular ease that comes when someone steps through the doors of a place where explanation is no longer required. That is what was inside Pulse before history arrived, not abstract identity categories, not cultural talking points, but the old human wish to be among others without shrinking. The club's own memorial language later described it as a place of joy, belonging, and friendship, and those are not decorative words. They are the emotional facts of why people went there. PulseOrlando.org 1. The victim's statement, then, is not a single testimony but a chorus. It says we came here to dance. It says we came here because the rest of the world can be exhausting. It says we came here because sometimes a nightclub is the nearest thing to sanctuary a person can afford. It says we did not come as symbols. We came alive with plans for the next day, with jobs to return to, with family complications, with little secrets, with birthdays, with grudges, with laughter, with cheap drinks sweating in our hands, with our phones buzzing in our pockets, with all the loose unfinished business that proves a life expected to continue. That is the first truth any honest telling has to preserve. The second is that when the violence began, the victims did what victims always do in the first impossible seconds of public catastrophe. They tried to understand whether what they were hearing could possibly be real. Survivor accounts and reporting from the first days after the massacre describe the shock of that transition from dance floor to panic, the disorienting lag between sound and recognition, between the body reacting and the mind accepting what the body already knew. Angel Colon, who survived after being shot, later described hearing shots and falling unable to walk, while doctors and reporters reconstructed how quickly the club became a scene of confusion and mass injury. The Guardian for Patience Carter, a 20-year-old who survived, spoke days later about how an ordinary stop at Pulse with friends ended with her trapped in a bathroom, seriously wounded, surrounded by terror and by people who would not all leave alive. PBS 5. Their accounts matter because they keep the victims human in the moment when public language tries to turn them into an event. They remind us that the room did not instantly divide into dead and living. For long minutes and then long hours, it held people who were hiding, whispering, praying, calling, texting, bleeding, trying to keep strangers quiet, trying to keep friends awake, trying to understand where the shooter was, trying to decide whether silence was safer than movement, trying to imagine rescue without being able to see it. The victim's statement, in that sense, is also made of interpreted senses and unfinished messages. It exists in the last ordinary things people said before language itself narrowed to survival. That is why one of the most haunting fragments from Pulse remains not a speech but a series of texts sent by Eddie Justice to his mother Minna while he was hiding inside the club. Contemporary reporting described Minna Justice waking to her phone and realizing, through the messages arriving one after another, that her son was trapped in the bathroom while the attack unfolded around him. ABC 7 San Francisco 6 Those messages have endured in public memory because they strip the event down to its most intimate scale. Not terror as a policy argument, not hate as an abstract social force, but a child reaching for his mother with the only tool still available to him. In the middle of the worst thing happening in the country that night, he did what frightened people do when they believe death may be close. He went home through language. He tried to make contact with the person who had first taught him safety, and through that thread of text messages, the nation glimpsed what mass violence really does. It pushes people back to their deepest bonds in the final minutes, back to family names and reassurance and love stripped of everything decorative. ABC 7 San Francisco 6 Yet even there inside fear, the victim's statement was larger than fear. It included the acts of care that happened between strangers and friends once the room became a trap. Survivor reporting in the immediate aftermath described people piling into bathrooms, lying still on floors, trying to shield one another, trying not to cry out, trying to survive by making themselves small. Patience Carter spoke publicly about being in the bathroom with two friends who did not survive, and her later reflections on survivor guilt captured a cruel truth of events like Pulse. Survival is not a clean rescue from suffering but often the beginning of another form of pain, the burden of remembering who was next to you and who never got up. PBS 5 Angel Collins' account likewise preserved the bewildered physicality of that night, the body suddenly broken, the floor no longer a place for dancing, but the only place left to hide. The Guardian for through these fragments, the victim's collective voice becomes legible. It says we were not passive scenery inside someone else's crime. We were calling each other. We were trying to stay calm. We were pressing into corners and holding on to whoever was nearest. We were imagining daylight. We were bargaining for one more minute. We were still people even as the country began to describe us in numbers. That insistence matters. Mass casualty violence tends to erase individuality twice, first through the act itself, and then through the language that follows it. The dead become a toll, the wounded become a count, the room becomes a site, but the official lists and later remembrances push back against that flattening. They restore names. Stanley Almodovar III, Amanda Alvear, Luis Omar Ocasio Capo, Edward Sotomayor Jr., Kimberly Morris, Frank Hernandez, Mercedes Marisol Flores, Javier Jorge Reyes, Jason Josephat, Darrell Roman Burke II. 49 names preserved by the city and the memorial site, each one evidence that the victim's statement cannot be singular because the lives taken were not singular. PulseOrlando.org 3 Some were close friends. Some were there with partners. Some were employees within the broader nightlife world. Some were local fixtures, known and loved in Orlando's queer and Latino communities. Reporting in the days after the attack emphasized that the dead included volunteers, bouncers, service workers, and people whose labor was as ordinary as their hopes. ABC News 7 What binds them in memory is not sameness but the room they shared, and the fact that the room itself had promised safety. That betrayal sits at the center of this section. A victim's statement, if we listen carefully, does not only describe terror, it also describes violation. It says this place was supposed to hold us. It says we came to Pulse because the world outside can be sharp, suspicious, humiliating, or lonely, and inside these walls there was music and warmth and recognition. The club's own memorial language, written after the fact, calls it a cherished LGBTQIA+ nightclub where everyone was welcomed, and could be their true selves. That phrasing helps explain why the wound cuts so deeply. A person attacked in a random place experiences horror. A person attacked in a refuge experiences something additional, the shattering of trust. PulseOrlando.org. One that is why Pulse reverberated so intensely through queer communities across the United States. The victim's statement was heard far beyond Orlando because so many LGBTQ people understood exactly what it meant to depend on a room like that. They heard, in the fate of those 49 people, an older communal fear returning in modern form. They heard the reminder that visibility does not guarantee safety, that a dance floor can still be marked as a target, that progress celebrated in headlines can evaporate under gunfire. The attack happened less than a year after same-sex marriage became legal nationwide, in a period when many outsiders spoke as though the central danger had passed. The victim's statement corrected that illusion with brutal force. It said we were still vulnerable. It said the room where we laughed was still fragile. It said belonging in America can remain conditional even after the law appears to change. PulseOrlando.org. One and still, even here, the statement cannot end inside fear alone, because the people of Pulse were not remembered only through the manner of their death. The memorial effort, the annual remembrances, the readings of the names, the artifacts preserved by local institutions, all suggest a community refusing to let violence have the final word over who those people were. The Orange County Regional History Center's exhibition language makes this plain when it speaks of personal histories linked by the outpouring of love and support. Stories of struggle and loss alongside stories of triumph and hope. Orange County Regional History Center 8. That is not sentimentality. It is a discipline of memory. It means the victim's statement must contain not only the terror of the bathroom and the floor and the unanswered text, but also the smiling photographs chosen later by families, the stories about kindness, the evidence of work and friendship and ambition and humor, the truth that what was destroyed was not anonymous life but specific life. It means part 3, if it is honest, has to hold both the final fear and the prior fullness. So the statement of the victims becomes something like this: we were here. We were more than the night that ended us. We were young and tired and hopeful and flawed and dancing. We came carrying all the ordinary details people carry into a weekend. Some of us had already fought hard just to stand in that room openly. Some of us had crossed distances of culture, family expectation, or private shame to get there. Some of us had finally found a place where our laughter did not sound defensive. When the attack began, we called our mothers, held our friends, hid where we could, and tried with all the frightened intelligence of the human body to remain alive. Some survived and carried the memory out into the world. Some did not, but none of us were born to become evidence in someone else's crime. We were not a headline waiting to happen. We were a community in motion, under colored lights, listening to music, believing for a little while that the night could keep us. That, more than any later argument about ideology or policy or motive, is what the victims left behind as testimony. A room full of people who had come to feel briefly unafraid, and whose longest statement to the country was that their lives had contained joy before they contained terror, and that any telling which forgets that first truth has already failed them. PulseOrlando.org. 1. Just after 2 a.m. on Sunday, June 12, 2016, Pulse was still alive in the way clubs are alive at the end of a good night, when the air has become warm from bodies and breath, when the music feels less like sound than pressure, when people have stopped worrying about how they look because everyone around them is already moving. It was Latin night, and there were roughly 300 people inside the club. Drinks were near last call. Some people were on the dance floor, some in the bar area, some in the bathrooms, some resting in the dimmer pockets of the building where the noise softened just enough for a conversation to happen face to face. Outside, Orlando was quiet in the particular way cities can be quiet before dawn. Traffic thinned, each still hanging over the pavement. Inside, nobody understood that the evening had already reached the edge of its life. At 2:02 a.m., according to the FBI's investigative timeline, the first law enforcement call went out reporting multiple shots fired at Pulse. An off-duty Orlando police officer working security at the club exchanged gunfire with the attacker near the entrance, as the gunman came in carrying a rifle and a handgun. Additional officers arrived within minutes, and by 2:08 a.m. officers from multiple agencies had entered the club and engaged in. Federal Bureau of Investigation warned the incident did not begin for the people inside as history. It began as noise that did not make sense. In crowded nightlife spaces, people are used to sound crashing over one another. Music can blur judgment. Sharp sounds can be mistaken for dropped objects, breaking glass, a speaker popping, some drunken commotion near the door. The mind resists the idea of slaughter while the body is still dancing. For at least a few seconds, perhaps longer for some, what happened was not yet fully understood. Then panic moved faster than thought. The shots were too many, too hard, too close. The room changed character at once. The dance floor became an open kill zone. People who had been facing one another in laughter turned and ran in opposite directions. Some fell immediately. Some threw themselves down because others were throwing themselves down. Some tried for the exits and found congestion, confusion, bodies colliding in the dark. Some sprinted toward the bathrooms because the bathrooms were nearer than the doors. And when death enters a room, proximity becomes destiny. The music that had given the night its rhythm was overtaken by a new rhythm, one made of screams, gunfire, shouted commands, and the blunt crash of bodies striking walls, floors, fixtures, one another. Later reconstructions found that many victims were killed in the stage area and on the dance floor during that initial burst of violence, while others died in the bathrooms and other parts of the club as the attack continued. Wikipedia to the first phase of the massacre was speed and shock. The second was entrapment. Patrons hid where they could, many in the club's bathrooms, others in dressing rooms or tucked into spaces not designed to hold terrified crowds. Officers were already on scene, but inside the building confusion was almost total. Survivors later described the instinctive calculations that took over in those minutes. Be still, keep quiet, silence the phone, do not cry out. Do not move unless movement gives you a better chance than staying where you are. Some people lay among the injured and the dead because there was nowhere else to go. Some tried to shield friends, some whispered prayers, some texted family. As rescues began, officers pulling survivors from the club had to shout into the dark for anyone alive to raise a hand. By around 2:22 a.m., according to the DOJ Critical Incident Review, officers had extracted nearly all the wounded they could immediately reach from the main club areas. But hostages and others still trapped remained inside. Federal Bureau of Investigation warned one of the most unbearable features of the Pulse incident is that it did not end quickly. It stretched from a mass shooting into a hostage crisis. At 2:18 a.m. Orlando Police SWAT initiated a full call-out. At 2:35 a.m., the FBI says, the gunman called 911 from inside the club, pledged allegiance to the leader of ISIS, and referred to U.S. military action overseas. The FBI later said he also spoke with crisis negotiators during the standoff. That meant the people still alive inside Pulse were not only victims of an initial attack, they were trapped inside a long, suspended terror in which time itself turned cruel. Minutes became something thick and distorted. Hope rose and collapsed with every sound outside the bathroom walls. Rescue felt both imminent and impossibly delayed. Federal Bureau of Investigation wanted is here, in that stretched and dreadful middle, that the incident takes on its most suffocating human shape. Nightclubs are built for concealment of one kind. They are designed with darkness, with selective pools of light, with narrow passages, enclosed rooms, loud sound, and sensory overload meant for pleasure. Under attack, all of that becomes hostile. Darkness protects and confuses at once. Light is fragmentary. Sight lines are poor. The same walls that create atmosphere create traps. People hiding in the bathrooms crowded together in conditions that must have felt unreal at first and then very quickly, horribly intimate. Every breath mattered because breath could become noise. Every vibrating phone mattered. Every groan from the injured mattered. Every rumor mattered. Survivors reported hearing the attacker speak about explosives and snipers, claims that intensified fear inside the club and uncertainty outside it. Some trapped patrons called or texted 911 warning of the possibility of explosives. That detail sharpened the crisis for responding officers, because a shooter with hostages is one horror, a shooter with hostages and possible bombs is another. Wikipedia too. For the people in hiding, the incident was no longer only about the shots already fired. It was about waiting inside the possibility of what might come next. Mothers and fathers miles away were pulled into the night through messages that are now inseparable from the memory of Pulse. Eddie Justice texted his mother, Minna, from inside a bathroom, telling her he was trapped and asking for help while the attack unfolded. Akira Murray's parents later shared the terrified messages they received when she and others inside begged to be picked up, not yet understanding that by the time such messages arrived, the road to the club was already leading into a catastrophe larger than any parent could outrun. These messages matter because they reveal the incident not as an abstract public emergency, but as hundreds of private emergencies happening at once, each contained in a phone screen glowing in the dark, each carrying the unbearable intimacy of someone reaching for home while hidden from death only by a locked stall door, a wall, or the simple luck of where they happened to be standing when the first shots were fired. ABC 7 Los Angeles 3 outside officers and emergency personnel faced the opposite torment. Too much information, too little certainty, lives bleeding away inside a building whose internal layout, active threat, hostage situation, and possible explosives had to be understood in real time. The DOJ review later described the response as a complex, fast-moving operation involving local, state, and federal agencies. Officers entered the club early and exchanged gunfire with the attacker, but once the shooting shifted into a barricaded hostage scenario centered on the bathrooms, commanders had to weigh the risks of waiting against the risks of immediate assault. Every delayed minute could mean more lives lost inside. Every rushed entry could also trigger even more killing, especially if explosives were real. These are the kinds of decisions that look cleaner in hindsight than they ever feel in the dark. At Pulse, they were made under the pressure of screams, fractured reports, and the knowledge that civilians were still alive within reach but not yet reachable. The cruelest aspect of the incident is that safety seemed so close and yet remained separated by concrete doors and minutes. People inside could hear activity outside. People outside knew there were survivors inside, but the wall between knowledge and rescue held. The FBI timeline states that no further shots were heard for a long stretch after the initial exchange until close to the final breach period. A silence that must have felt to those trapped inside like both a reprieve and a threat. Silence in such a setting is never peace. Silence only sharpens the imagination. It asks whether the shooter is listening, moving, choosing, reloading, preparing. It leaves the hidden to their own heartbeat. It leaves the wounded to pain and blood loss. It leaves friends pressed together without anything useful left to say. Wikipedia to some time before the final police assault, that silence broke again. According to the FBI summary and later reporting, the attacker moved into the women's bathroom area where hostages were hiding and opened fire again, killing additional people during the standoff phase. That detail darkens the whole chronology because it means some victims survived the initial eruption only to be killed later, after enduring the terror of waiting. They had already crossed from nightlife into nightmare and were still denied escape, This is why the incident cannot be told as one burst of violence and then a tactical conclusion. It was a series of descending chambers, first disbelief, then panic, then concealment, then waiting, then renewed killing inside the place that had seemed, however briefly, the best hiding place available. Wikipedia to by around 5 a.m., law enforcement had concluded that a forced entry into the bathroom area was necessary. At 5:02 a.m., police used a controlled explosion, according to Timeline reports. When that failed to create an opening large enough because of the wall structure, an armored vehicle was used to breach the wall near the bathrooms. At approximately 5:14 a.m., officers made the decisive breach using distraction devices, and the attacker emerged into the hallway. At 5:15 a.m., according to the FBI's timeline, officers shot and killed him. Roughly 30 hostages were then freed during the final police action. The attack, which had begun at 2:02 a.m., ended a little more than 3 hours later, but for the people inside it had to have felt much longer, a whole dark age compressed into one summer night. Federal Bureau of Investigation 1 dawn did not arrive as relief so much as revelation. What emerged in those first morning hours was the scale of devastation. 49 victims had been murdered, with dozens more injured. More than 50 people were wounded overall. The dead were found across the club, with large numbers on the dance floor and stage area, and others in the bathrooms where many had tried to hide. The number itself stunned the country, but numbers never capture the visual truth of such a place after violence. The truth was a nightclub stripped of its purpose, its floor littered not with cups and confetti and the ordinary debris of celebration, but with the evidence of a massacre. The flashing club lights were replaced by tactical lights and emergency strobes. The bathrooms that had offered a last illusion of enclosure became some of the scene's most tragic chambers. The building held, all at once, the end of a party, the remains of a siege, and the first raw hours of a crime scene whose meaning the nation had not yet fully begun to absorb. Encyclopedia Britannica for the incident reverberated because of what it was, but also because of where it happened and who was inside. Pulse was an LGBTQ nightclub holding Latin night. Most of the victims were Latino. The attack therefore landed not on an anonymous crowd but on a community space dense with belonging, memory, and trust. In practical terms, the incident lasted from 2:02 a.m. to 5:15 a.m. In emotional terms, it shattered something much older and more fragile, the belief that one could step into a queer sanctuary, into music and darkness and friendship, and be held there for a few hours beyond the reach of the world's ugliest intentions. That is why the incident remains fixed in national memory, not just as a mass shooting or a hostage crisis or a terror case, but as the violent inversion of a space built for joy. People went to Pulse to dance through the last warm hours before dawn. Instead, they were driven to floors, into bathrooms, behind doors, into text messages to parents, into silence, into prayer, into blood, into history. The attack took only a few minutes to begin and more than 3 hours to end, but the true shape of it is measured less by the clock than by the transformation it imposed. One ordinary nightclub night in Orlando, bright with music and relief and human closeness, turned by deliberate violence into one of the darkest crime scenes in modern American memory. Federal Bureau of Investigation 1. When the shooting finally ended a little after 5:15 in the morning, Pulse stopped being a nightclub in any ordinary sense and became, all at once, a sealed chamber of evidence, grief, and unanswered questions. Hours earlier it had been a space of bass and colored light, a place arranged for rhythm, flirtation, and release. Now the rooms inside it held the stillness that follows concentrated violence, the kind of stillness that does not feel peaceful but stunned, as though the building itself had been forced into disbelief. The first officers, medics, and investigators moving through the club after the final breach did not enter a single scene so much as a sequence of scenes layered over one another. There was the main dance floor area near the entrance, where the first burst of gunfire had torn through a crowd that had no time to understand what was happening. There were the bar and stage areas, where the night's energy had collapsed into panic and then into silence. There were the bathrooms, which had become the most tragic rooms in the building, places chosen in desperation because they were close, enclosed, and for a few terrible minutes seemed safer than the open floor. The Department of Justice's incident review later described the attack as an event of extreme violence, carnage, and confusion, and that phrasing, sober as it is, suggests the scale of what responders met once the crisis phase gave way to forensic reality. Federal Bureau of Investigation 1. The crime scene told its first story through geography. Where the wounded and the dead were found mattered because placement could reveal the rhythm of the attack more clearly than rumor ever could. Early public accounts and later summaries indicated that many victims were located unarmed near the dance floor and stage area, consistent with the initial rapid gunfire just after 2 a.m., while others were found in and around the bathrooms where patrons had run to hide when escape routes vanished into chaos. Britannica notes that the gunman opened fire near the entrance with more than 300 people inside, and the FBI timeline confirms that officers exchanged gunfire with him within minutes, meaning investigators were looking at a scene shaped by two overlapping kinds of ballistic evidence almost immediately: the attackers' sustained fire and the defensive shots fired by law enforcement in the opening phase and again during the final breach. Encyclopedia Britannica 2. That made the nightclub not only a homicide scene but also a technical puzzle. Every casing, every impact mark, every damaged surface had to be read carefully to reconstruct movement through rooms that had been dark, crowded, and full of panicked bodies. In the abstract, forensic work sounds clean and methodical. In reality, in a place like Pulse, it begins in the emotional wreckage of ordinary life interrupted, shoes separated from their owners, phones still lit or ringing, drinks overturned and drying on floors never meant to hold blood, personal belongings abandoned mid-flight. All of it had to be documented because all of it might help establish sequence. All of it also testified to the human speed with which celebration had become catastrophe. The initial clues investigators relied on were therefore not only dramatic ones like weapons and calls to police. They were also the mute clues left by movement, where people fell, where they clustered, where they tried to barricade themselves, where they waited for help that could not reach them fast enough. Federal Bureau of Investigation 1. One of the most important early clues was the weapon profile. Investigators quickly established that the gunman had entered the club armed with a Sig Sauer MCX semi-automatic rifle and a Glock 17 9mm semi-automatic pistol. Britannica reports that he had legally purchased the rifle on June 4, 2016, and the pistol on June 5, just a week before the massacre. That mattered immediately because it showed preparation close in time to the attack and also underscored a grim reality that would become central to the national conversation afterward. These were not improvised tools acquired in panic, but recently purchased firearms obtained through legal channels. The weapon choice also helped explain the scale of injury inside the club. A crowded indoor environment, dimly lit and full of civilians at close range, becomes lethally vulnerable when a shooter carries both a semi-automatic rifle and a handgun. Even before the full motive picture came into focus, the presence of those weapons inside Pulse was itself an initial clue about intent, capability, and the likely rapidity of mass casualties in the first minutes. Encyclopedia Britannica 2. The other major clue came from communication rather than physical evidence. At 2:35 a.m., while still inside Pulse, the gunman called 911. In the FBI's released summary, he identified himself and pledged allegiance to Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi of the Islamic State. In subsequent conversations with Orlando police negotiators, he referred to U.S. bombing in Syria and Iraq and said that was why he was there. Those statements arrived early enough to shape the first investigative lens through which authorities viewed the scene. Even while the crime scene was still active and hostages were still inside, law enforcement was already trying to determine whether this was a local grievance, a heat attack, a terror-inspired assault, or some unstable fusion of these. The call did not answer that question cleanly, but it immediately made ideology part of the evidence trail. Investigators could no longer treat the nightclub as only a local mass murder scene. It had also become a possible terrorism case, which expanded the urgency of searching for accomplices, explosives, communications, and any sign that the attack was part of something larger than one man and one night. Federal Bureau of Investigation 3 that fear of something larger was intensified by another set of clues emerging from inside the club during the standoff. The gunman's references to bombs and explosive vests. The FBI timeline says that during negotiations he warned of a vehicle outside with bombs and claimed to have explosive devices. The same timeline records that by 4:29 a.m., as victims were being rescued, police were told the gunman had said he would put bomb vests on victims within 15 minutes. Dispatch records later reported by WLRN show how seriously authorities treated these claims in real time, including concern around the shooter's vehicle and the possibility of additional devices. These were crucial initial clues because they shaped the tactical response, delayed certain rescue possibilities, and widened the crime scene beyond the club interior to the parking area and, potentially, to any connected location the suspect had used that night. They also meant that bomb technicians and specialized personnel had to read the site not just as a shooting scene but as a possible explosive scene. In the first hours after dawn, that uncertainty hung over every search. A vehicle was not just a vehicle, a bag was not just a bag. Every untouched corner had to be approached with the possibility that the violence might not yet be over. Federal Bureau of Investigation 3 as investigators pressed outward from the club, the crime scene expanded by concentric rings. The interior of Pulse was the center, but outside it were the parking lot, the suspect's vehicle, routes of approach, surveillance opportunities, and later the suspect's home and digital footprint. Early reporting and official summaries made clear that bomb disposal and law enforcement teams checked the vehicle after the attack because of the shooter's own claims. That search was part of the first attempt to distinguish bluff from capacity. If the vehicle contained actual explosives, the attack might have been intended to continue or to kill first responders. If it did not, the claims themselves still mattered as psychological evidence. They showed a desire to manipulate negotiations, heighten fear, and force police to divide attention between rescue and catastrophic uncertainty. Investigators also had to determine whether anyone else knew of the plan, helped with transport, or stood ready elsewhere. Reuters reported in the immediate aftermath that authorities were examining whether anyone had assisted him, though they said they did not believe there was an ongoing threat from connected individuals at that stage. That is one of the less visible truths about the first day of a mass casualty investigation. The scene itself may suggest one attacker, but until evidence hardens, investigators must treat the edges of the case as unstable. WLRN.org for Inside the Club. Meanwhile, the initial clues about sequence came not only from objects, but from survivors. The FBI's June 20th update states that significant information obtained from victims allowed Orlando police to gain knowledge of the situation inside Pulse during the standoff. The city of Orlando later noted that hundreds of 911 communications existed, and that many recordings and transcripts were protected for a time under Florida law because they recorded killings or events directly related to death. That matters because those calls formed part of the earliest evidentiary map. Hidden patrons described where the shooter was moving, where the wounded were lying, which rooms still held survivors, and what threats he was making. Their voices became a kind of living crime scene diagram, assembled under pressure from whispers, gasps, and desperate attempts to be precise while hiding from death. The initial clues of the case therefore came from two intertwined sources: the silent physical arrangement of the club after the shooting and the terrified human testimony transmitted from within it before the shooting was over. Together they began to tell authorities which areas had been hit first, where hostages were concentrated, when the gunman shifted into the bathroom area, and how urgent the final breach had become. Federal Bureau of Investigation 3. Another early clue lay in the suspect's background and the legal paper trail that surfaced almost immediately. Investigators already knew by the first day that he had been on the FBI's radar in earlier years. Britannica summarizes that he had been the subject of an FBI preliminary investigation in 2013 after making statements to coworkers about ties to Al-Qaeda and Hezbollah, and was questioned again in 2014 after contact with an individual who became a suicide bomber in Syria. But both inquiries were closed without actionable evidence. That background did not explain the Pulse crime scene, but it shaped the first hypotheses around motive and premeditation. When authorities walked the club that morning, they were not looking at an offender who had appeared from nowhere. They were looking at a suspect whose name had existed before in counterterrorism files, whose prior statements suggested ideological posing or fixation, and who nonetheless had been able to buy the weapons used in the attack legally days before entering the club. That convergence of clues made the case reverberate almost instantly beyond Orlando. The crime scene raised local questions about targeting and tactics. The background file raised national questions about watch lists, intervention failures, and the gap between suspicion and lawful prevention. Encyclopedia Britannica to yet motive was never the only question written into the building. The scene also posed the more intimate question of targeting. Why Pulse? Why a queer nightclub? Why Latin Night? In the first hours, authorities could not answer that conclusively. The shooter's 911 pledge pointed toward terror ideology, but the location pointed unmistakably toward an LGBTQ venue, and the event that night had drawn a heavily Latino crowd. Most of the victims were Latino, according to Reuters, which meant that from the outset investigators and the public alike had to contemplate the possibility that the crime carried multiple layers of targeting at once. The club's history as one of Orlando's most prominent LGBTQ spaces made the location itself an initial clue. It suggested that even if the shooter's ideological declarations were sincere, the setting might still matter in a separate, deeply personal way. Was the venue chosen for symbolism, vulnerability, opportunity, personal grievance, hate, or some mix of all of them? Crime scenes do not answer such questions cleanly. They offer fragments: a chosen destination, a specific night, a known community space, recent firearm purchases, a terror pledge, bomb claims, earlier FBI interest. Those fragments formed the first investigative mosaic, though no single piece was enough by itself. Encyclopedia Britannica 5. The physical condition of the club also mattered because it showed how the architecture of refuge had been turned against those seeking it. Bathrooms became last resort hiding places. A dressing room window and its air conditioning unit became a desperate evacuation route, with the FBI noting that at 4:21 a.m. officers pulled an air conditioning unit out of a Pulse dressing room window for victims to evacuate. That tiny detail, almost mundane on paper, is one of the sharpest clues to how trapped many patrons were in a different kind of night. Such a fixture would be invisible. In this one, it became part of the survival story and part of the crime scene record. Every forced opening, every breached wall, every improvised route used by the living would later help investigators reconstruct the difference between where people intended to go and where violence forced them instead. The club ceased to be a social space and became, in forensic terms, a map of blocked movement. Federal Bureau of Investigation 3. By the end of that first day, the initial clues had established several hard truths, even while larger meanings remained unsettled. Authorities knew the attack began just after 2 a.m. and ended when officers killed the gunman around 5:15 a.m. They knew 49 victims had been murdered and more than 50 others wounded. They knew the killer had carried two legally purchased firearms into a crowded LGBTQ nightclub during Latin night. They knew he had called 911 from inside and pledged allegiance to ISIS, while also making bomb claims that shaped the standoff response. They knew survivors' calls from hiding had provided critical information about conditions inside. And they knew the nightclub itself, once entered as a place of joy, now held the layered evidence of a massacre whose meaning would be argued nationally for years. But the first day's crime scene offered something deeper than a checklist of clues. It showed, in the cold language of placement and damage and recovered objects, the exact point where sanctuary failed. It showed how people had run not toward heroism or history but toward bathrooms, corners, and silence. It showed how a building made for music can, in a matter of minutes, be rewritten by gunfire into evidence. And in that sense, the initial clues of the Pulse case were not merely about identifying a perpetrator. They were about understanding the shape of violation itself. A queer community space struck during one of its liveliest nights, a crowd hunted indoors, a long standoff prolonged by bomb threats and uncertainty, and a dawn crime scene so heavy with personal traces that every technical conclusion would always sit beside a more painful one. The investigators could measure trajectories and confirm purchases and analyze calls. What the walls of Pulse said more quietly was simpler and harsher. People had come there to feel briefly safe. And the first clues left behind after the killing were the scattered proofs of how completely that trust had been broken. Encyclopedia Britannica 2. By the time the bodies had been counted and the first and headlines had hardened into a national story, the investigation had already begun to move in two directions at once. One direction was outward, fast and urgent, driven by fear that the man who had turned Pulse into a killing ground might not have acted alone. The other was inward, slower and more frustrating, aimed at the deeper question that haunts every case like this. Who exactly had this man been before he stepped through those doors? And what combination of grievance, fantasy, ideology, rage, and self-invention had carried him there? In the first hours after the shooting, investigators could not afford philosophical uncertainty. They had to think in practical worst cases. Had someone driven him, supplied him, encouraged him? Was the nightclub only one strike in a wider plan? Did his bomb claims point to a second scene still waiting to erupt somewhere else? The FBI's early public statements reflected that urgency. James Comey said on June 13, 2016 that agents were trying to understand every moment of the killer's path to Orlando and whether anyone else had been involved, either in directing him or assisting him, while also saying that, so far, the FBI saw no indication the plot had been directed from outside the United States and no indication that he was part of any network. That combination of alarm and restraint defined the first stage of the investigation. Authorities had to examine every possibility as though it might open into a broader conspiracy, even as the early evidence already suggested the lonelier, more infuriating truth of a self-directed attacker whose violence was vast enough without accomplices. The fear of accomplices was not paranoia. It was built into the structure of the crime itself. During the standoff, the shooter had pledged allegiance to ISIS and spoke in the language of global jihad. He also claimed there were bombs in a vehicle outside and said he had a vest like those used in attacks in France. Investigators had to treat those statements as potentially real until the scene disproved them. The FBI's June 20th update records that victims being rescued from the club reported that the shooter had threatened to put bomb vests on hostages within minutes. and law enforcement searched both the suspect's vehicle and the club for explosive devices before determining that no Vastor improvised explosive device had been found. That matters because it shows how the early investigation was dragged into a hall of mirrors built partly by the killer himself. He had created a scene in which law enforcement had to consider terrorism, explosives, accomplices, ideology, and hostage murder all at once. Every minute of uncertainty widened the field of suspicion. A vehicle became a possible bomb, a spouse became a possible accomplice, a phone record became a possible trail to a cell or recruiter. The investigation's first dead end, then, was the most frightening one. The possibility that Pulse was merely one visible piece of something larger. It led nowhere. No bomb was found. No outside operational network was uncovered. No directed foreign plot emerged. What remained was still terrible, but it was narrower than the first nightmare had suggested. Even once the fear of a broader network began to recede, another line of inquiry kept the investigation sprawling. The suspect himself seemed to have spent years constructing and reconstructing identities in ways that made simple motive almost impossible to pin down. Comey's June 13th briefing acknowledged that the FBI had encountered him before. In 2013, coworkers had reported inflammatory and contradictory comments about terrorist ties, prompting a preliminary investigation. In 2014, he surfaced again because of contact with a Florida man who later became a suicide bomber in Syria. Both inquiries were closed after investigators found no evidence of a continuing threat or meaningful operational link. The existence of those earlier inquiries immediately reopened a familiar American wound. How could someone who had once been on the FBI's radar purchase the weapons used in the attack only days before the massacre? Reuters reported the same day as the attack that his employer, G4S, had also screened him in earlier years without finding anything disqualifying. To the public, this looked like the shape of a preventable failure. To investigators, it became another dead end of a different kind, not a missed clue buried in plain sight, but a trail of alarming statements that had not ripened into prosecutable evidence before the night of the killings. Suspicion in a constitutional system does not automatically become intervention. That gap between concern and lawful action became one of the investigation's most bitter afterimages. The investigation also had to contend with the killer's ideological inconsistency, which made him seem at once calculating and incoherent. Comey said on June 13th that it was not entirely clear what terrorist group he aspired to support, even though he had expressed affinity during the attack for ISIS and, more generally, for radical Islamist groups. That ambiguity mattered. A cleanly directed terror plot is easier in some ways to explain. A self-radicalized man borrowing slogans, loyalties, and grievances from multiple extremist currents is harder to read because his declarations may be sincere, opportunistic, theatrical, or all three at once. He invoked ISIS, yet his earlier recorded statements had also name-dropped organizations hostile to one another. He spoke the language of geopolitical revenge, yet the act itself unfolded inside a local queer nightclub in Florida. He seemed to want the prestige of ideological violence, but prestige-seeking itself can be part of the motive. The investigation kept running into that wall. Was this principally terrorism with a queer venue as the chosen stage, or an attack on a queer venue dressed in the language of terrorism to enlarge its meaning? Officials could speak confidently about strong indications of radicalization and foreign terrorist inspiration, but the inner ratios of grievance, hate, fantasy,